The baby's cries pierced through the cabin, echoing louder than the engines of the Boeing 787. First-class passengers groaned, flight attendants exchanged helpless looks, and a billionaire father sat broken, sweat dripping as his 6-month-old daughter refused to be calmed. No bottle, no toy, no soothing words could stop the storm. And then, out of the crowded economy section, a poor black teenager stood up, his eyes steady, his hands trembling with courage. What he did next left everyone on that plane in shock, and it changed both of their lives forever. Before we begin this incredible journey, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this one. And comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. Now, let's dive into the story. The sound began like a hairline crack in glass, sharp and fragile, but within seconds it shattered the calm of the cabin into chaos. The baby's cry was not the soft whimper of hunger or the restless stir of sleep. It was a piercing, relentless wail that tore through the recycled air of the Boeing 787's first-class cabin. Each note seemed to vibrate against the metal fuselage, weaving through the gentle drone of the engines, louder than the clink of champagne glasses or the rustle of newspapers. It was a cry that refused to be ignored. Harrison Reed sat rigid in seat 2A. Italian silk suit rumpled and damp from the sweat gathering at his collar. His 6-month-old daughter Olivia writhed in his arms, her small fists thrashing as though battling invisible demons. Her face was flushed an alarming crimson, eyes squeezed tight, mouth stretched in a perfect oval of fury. He bounced her, he patted her back, he whispered every lullaby he half-remembered from a book his wife had once pressed into his hands. Nothing worked. Harrison Reed was a man who had stared down Fortune 500 boardrooms, dismantled competitors with the flick of a pen, and carved an empire out of code and ambition. But here, in this moment, he was helpless. Sweat beaded along his hairline as he rocked his daughter against his chest. Every muscle in his body screamed for sleep, for relief, for an answer that would not come. Passengers turned, some with curiosity, others with the sharp irritation of interrupted luxury. An elderly woman in pearls clucked her tongue, muttering to her companion about parents these days. A businessman across the aisle slammed his laptop shut, jammed headphones into his ears, and glared with the exasperation of a man who believed his ticket had purchased him silence. The flight attendant approached again, her smile worn thin as paper. "Sir," she said, voice pitched to be heard of. The shrieks. "We've had several complaints. Is there anything else we can do to help?" Harrison's hand trembled as he dabbed his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. "I've tried everything," he rasped, his throat hoarse from hours of murmuring and shushing. "Bottles, toys, walking up and down the aisle." His voice cracked. "Nothing works." 3 hours into the transatlantic journey and still the child screamed. The cabin, once a haven of whispered deals and polite laughter, now seemed to shrink with each rising note. The polished veneer of first class was cracking, and Harrison could feel it. The stares, the judgment, the silent verdict that even billions of dollars could not buy control of a baby. In his mind, fragments of memory tangled. The last time he'd spoken to his wife, Catherine, who was waiting in Paris. Her voice had been crisp over the phone, reminding him of the importance of appearances. Appearances. What appearance was he giving now? Hair mussed, shirt damp, his daughter's wail echoing through the cabin like an indictment? Harrison tightened his grip on Olivia, his heart aching at the sight of her tiny body racked with distress. He kissed her damp forehead, whispering words he barely believed himself. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here. Please, just rest." But the cries only grew louder, more insistent, as though mocking the futility of his efforts. Around him, the cabin simmered with unspoken frustration. A curtain rustled in the back, separating first class from economy, but even that heavy fabric could not block the sound. Somewhere behind it, beyond the seats and the rules and the invisible walls of class, someone else was listening. Someone who would soon make a decision that neither Harrison Reed nor the other passengers could have predicted. But in this moment, Harrison's world had shrunk to the weight of a child against his chest. The burn of humiliation in his veins, and the terrifying realization that there are battles no amount of power, wealth, or intellect can win. The baby cried on, each note drilling deeper, breaking down walls Harrison had built his entire life. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt not powerful, not untouchable, but desperately, utterly human. The curtain at the back of first class swayed with each step of the flight attendants, a velvet wall meant to separate two worlds. On one side, leather seats reclined into beds, glasses of wine tilted under soft lighting, and a billionaire father unraveled before strangers. On the other side, knees brushed against tray tables, the air smelled faintly of reheated meals, and dreams were carried in second-hand backpacks. Marcus Johnson sat in seat 43C, pressed against the cold plastic of the window. His hoodie, frayed at the cuffs, was pulled low over his brow. In his lap sat a magnetic travel chessboard, the pieces lined up in perfect formation as though preparing for battle. He had intended to spend the flight studying openings for the International Youth Championship, his one chance at a scholarship. But the sound, that terrible, endless crying, cut through even the hum of his earbuds. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes closing, willing himself to block it out. "Focus," he muttered. "Focus, or you lose everything." Tomorrow, he would be in London, seated across from opponents who had been trained since childhood, coached by grandmasters, funded by institutions. And here he was, the boy from the south side of Chicago, raised in an apartment with peeling paint and a mother who worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. But no matter how tightly he pressed his eyes shut, the crying dragged him back. Not to this plane, not to this moment, but to a tiny apartment where he had cradled his baby sister Zoe in the dead of night. He remembered her tiny body trembling against his chest, her cries like a knife in the dark. His mother had been too exhausted to stand. He, barely 11, had stepped in. Somehow his hands had found a rhythm, his voice had found a hum, and his sister had quieted. His mother had called it the magic touch. Marcus stared at the curtain again. Behind it was a billionaire in a silk suit, desperate and defeated. Marcus knew that look, had seen it in the mirror the nights he worried about eviction notices or his mother's weary eyes. The look of someone cornered by life. He shook his head. "Not my problem," he whispered. He needed rest, clarity, strength. This was his moment, his shot at changing everything for himself, for his family. What did it matter if a stranger's baby cried? And yet, the cries grew louder, shredding the thin curtain between classes, echoing inside Marcus's chest like a call he couldn't ignore. His fingers hovered over the chessboard, tracing the night's smooth plastic edge. He thought about chess, about how the most powerful moves were often the quietest, the ones no one saw coming. His heart pounded. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "You don't walk away when someone needs you, Marcus. Not if you can help." A flight attendant rattled by with a beverage cart, her face tight with annoyance. Marcus pulled down his hoodie and stood, his lanky frame unfolding awkwardly in the cramped aisle. "Sir," the attendant snapped, her tone sharp, "please return to your seat. We're experiencing turbulence." Marcus kept his voice calm but firm, the way he always did when people underestimated him. "That baby's been crying for hours. I think I can help." Her eyes flicked over him. The hoodie, the scuffed sneakers, the skin too dark, too familiar with suspicion. He felt the weight of her judgment settle on him like chains. He had known this look his whole life. The store clerk trailing him down aisles, the teacher doubting his placement in advanced classes, the opponent smirking. Until checkmate. The attendant's lips thinned. "First class is off limits unless you're ticketed." Marcus's pulse thundered in his ears. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe he should sit down and let the billionaire flail with his daughter. But then, the curtain jerked open. There stood Harrison Reed, hair disheveled, shirt stained with his daughter's tears. The billionaire looked nothing like the magazine covers that painted him as untouchable. He looked like a man begging for rescue. "Please," Harrison's voice broke, echoing across both cabins. "I'll pay anyone who can make her stop crying." The silence that followed was heavy, passengers shifting in their seats, avoiding his eyes. No one moved, except Marcus. He stepped forward, raising his hands slightly as if approaching a wild animal. "Sir," he said, voice low, steady, "I might be able to help." Harrison's gaze locked on him, a storm of doubt flickering across his face. What could this boy, this stranger from economy, possibly know that he didn't? But desperation won. 3 hours of relentless crying had stripped him bare. "You have experience?" Harrison asked, his tone clipped but trembling. Marcus met his eyes without flinching. "My little sister had colic. I learned how to calm her when nothing else worked. May I?" The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Harrison hesitated for one agonizing beat, then extended the wailing infant toward Marcus. And in that moment, a poor boy from the back of the plane stepped across the curtain, into first class, and into the heart of a story that would change both of their lives forever. The baby's cries clung to the air like smoke, suffocating everyone in earshot. Even as Harrison Reed, billionaire titan of industry, pushed his daughter into the arms of a boy who looked nothing like the world he came from, the sound refused to die. It was as though Olivia's tiny lungs carried every ounce of her father's failure. Marcus Johnson felt the weight of that failure the second she touched his chest. Her body was hot, trembling, fists curled like she was ready to fight the world itself. He adjusted his grip instinctively, one hand supporting her fragile head, the other resting lightly against her back. Her scream hit his ear like a siren, but he didn't flinch. He'd been here before. The cabin was silent, every eye trained on him. Strangers leaned over first-class partitions. Businessmen froze mid-email. Attendants hovered at the aisle's edge. The boy from economy, hoodie sleeves stretched and frayed, now stood in the center of privilege, holding the daughter of a man worth billions. And no one knew what would happen next. Marcus closed his eyes for a beat. Memory guided him, late nights in a dim Chicago apartment, Zoe's cries echoing off thin walls, his mother's exhaustion heavy in the air. It wasn't about tricks, wasn't about toys or money. It was about presence, patience, rhythm. He shifted Olivia slightly, pressing her small body against his chest so she could feel the rise and fall of his breathing. He inhaled deep, slow, deliberate, then exhaled in the same measured rhythm. Babies mirror what they feel, his mother used to say. If you panic, they panic. If you breathe, they learn to breathe with you. He hummed low in his chest, not a lullaby, but something more primal, a sound that vibrated through him into her. His fingers moved in small circles on her back, finding the spots he remembered calmed Zoe when nothing else worked. Gentle pressure, stia. Die rhythm. For a moment, the cries continued, piercing, relentless. Harrison shifted uneasily, the doubt flashing across his face like a neon sign. What had he done, handing his daughter to a stranger? The flight attendant's jaw was tight, ready to intervene. Then, a pause. The scream cracked, dipped into a hiccup. Olivia's tiny fists loosened, her chest shuddered, her crimson face softened a shade. The noise dropped from piercing shriek to desperate whimper, then to a series of small hiccups. And finally, silence. It was as if the entire cabin exhaled at once. An elderly woman who had been muttering complaints just minutes before now clutched her pearls in astonishment. The businessman slid his headphones down, blinking at the quiet. One attendant's eyes glistened with something dangerously close to tears. Marcus rocked gently, humming still, eyes soft on the child's face. "There you go," he whispered. "Feels better, doesn't it? You were trying to tell them, but no one understood. Now you don't have to fight so hard." Harrison stared, awe etched across his exhausted features. For years he had paid for the best, consultants, pediatricians, specialists. Yet none of them had given him this. And here stood a boy who carried nothing but a travel chess set and a hoodie, calming his daughter with nothing but his hands and his presence. How did you do that?" Harrison's voice cracked, the edge of power gone, replaced with raw wonder. Marcus didn't look up. He kept his rhythm steady, fingers still circling Olivia's back. "My sister was like this, nights on end. You learn what works when it's just you and her, and no one else coming to help. Sometimes it's not about the things you buy, it's about the way you breathe with them." The billionaire, used to boardrooms and contracts, fell silent. His hands that had signed billion-dollar deals, trembled as he reached out, desperate to mimic the boy's motions. "Show me," Harrison said, his voice barely more than a plea. Marcus nodded, carefully transferring Olivia back. He guided Harrison's hands, adjusting the pressure, whispering the rhythm. For the first time, Harrison felt his daughter relax in his arms, not because of wealth or power, but because he had learned something passed down through a poor Chicago family's survival. And as the plane hummed steadily through the dark sky above the Atlantic, everyone in first class knew they had witnessed something rare. The moment a billionaire was taught humility by a boy the world might otherwise ignore. But for Marcus, this was just the beginning. Because while Olivia slept peacefully, his own battle was waiting across the ocean, a chessboard where one wrong move could cost him his future. And now, with the weight of a billionaire's attention, the stakes had grown higher than he ever imagined. The cabin lights dimmed to a golden hush, as if the plane itself had settled in disbelief. Olivia Reed slept now, tiny fingers curled against her father's chest, her breath a gentle rhythm where chaos had once thundered. For the first time in 3 hours, silence reigned. And in that silence, a billionaire and a boy from Chicago stood face to face, separated by everything in the world except the fragile peace of a sleeping child. Harrison Reed adjusted his grip on his daughter, still stunned that the storm had passed so quickly. His mind raced, searching for logic, for a pattern that explained how a 17-year-old in a frayed hoodie had succeeded where seasoned experts had failed. His voice, normally sharp with authority, came out quieter than he expected. You really did it. What's your name? Marcus. The boy replied simply, his tone respectful but steady. No awe, no apology, just a fact. Marcus Johnson. The name hung in Harrison's thoughts like a piece on a chessboard he hadn't noticed until too late. He gestured to the empty seat beside him. Sit, at least until she wakes. The invitation shocked the first-class passengers more than the silence had. They had seen the boy emerge from behind the curtain carrying nothing but confidence and calm, and now he was being ushered into leather seats that cost more than his family's rent for a year. Whispers flitted through the cabin, but Harrison didn't notice. His world had narrowed to this young man who carried answers in his hands. Marcus hesitated only briefly, glancing back toward economy where his chess set waited in the seat pocket. Then he slid into the seat beside Harrison, his posture careful, as though trying not to disturb the fragile truce of the moment. Harrison studied him, taking in the worn sneakers, the long fingers still trembling slightly from holding his daughter, the eyes that seemed older than his age. You've done this before, Harrison said, more statement than question. My sister, Marcus replied. Colic. Every night felt like a war. I learned how to listen, how to breathe when she couldn't. He shrugged lightly, as if calming a screaming baby at 35,000 feet was no more remarkable than tying a shoe. Harrison exhaled, leaning back into his seat. I've hired consultants, doctors, specialists. None of them gave me this. You make it sound simple. Marcus turned to him, and for the first time there was a flicker of sharpness in his voice. It is simple. But simple doesn't mean easy. It takes time, patience, presence. Things most people don't think matter when they've got money to throw at problems. The words struck deeper than Harrison expected. He bristled instinctively. No one spoke to him like that, but instead of snapping back, he felt a strange pull of respect, because the boy was right. The baby stirred then, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Both men froze. Harrison's pulse spiked, fear flashing across his face. What if she started again? Breathe, Marcus said quietly, his eyes on Harrison's hands. Don't panic, she'll feel it. Harrison obeyed, inhaling slowly, exhaling to match. Olivia shifted, sighed, and fell back into deeper sleep. Harrison looked down at his daughter in awe. For the first time since Catherine had convinced him they needed a child, he felt something he hadn't known he was missing. Confidence. Not in his money, not in his power, but in himself as a father. He turned back to Marcus. Where are you headed? College? Marcus shook his head. London, chess tournament, international youth championship. Harrison blinked, taken aback. Chess? Marcus nodded. My one chance at a scholarship. If I win, I can pay for school. Maybe more. If I lose. He let the thought trail off. Harrison's mind, wired for straight A, guy, instantly recognized the stakes. This wasn't just a boy with a knack for babies. This was someone playing for survival, each move on and off the board a calculation. Show me, Harrison said suddenly. Marcus frowned. Show you what? Harrison gestured toward the tray table. Your game, the way you think. I want to see it. Marcus reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out the miniature magnetic chess set, pieces clinking softly as he unfolded it. He set them in place with practiced precision, his long fingers moving like a pianist preparing for performance. The billionaire leaned closer, studying the board as if it held secrets beyond black and white squares. In chess, Marcus began, his voice low, it's not about strength, it's about patience, seeing patterns no one else notices, waiting for the right moment to move. He slid a pawn forward, deliberate, calm. And sometimes, the quietest move changes everything. The words echoed in Harrison's chest, heavier than he expected. His daughter shifted softly in his arms. The board gleamed under the cabin lights, and the boy beside him seemed suddenly less like a stranger and more like a mirror he hadn't known he needed. For the first time in years, Harrison Reed felt something powerful yet unfamiliar. Curiosity not about markets or mergers, but about a 17-year-old from Chicago who had stepped across a curtain and rewritten the balance of an entire flight. And as the engines roared them steadily toward Europe, both men realized they had just made their opening moves in a game neither could yet see the end of. The steady hum of the engines became the backdrop for an unlikely silence, the kind that settles only after a storm has torn through. Olivia Reed slept in her bassinet now, one tiny hand flung open as if claiming victory over the cabin. The passengers who had been muttering and sighing just an hour earlier now glanced sideways at the pair in seat 2A. Some still disbelieving what they had seen. But between the boy and the billionaire, the air was alive with something heavier than curiosity. It was the start of a reckoning. Harrison Reed leaned back, his cufflinks catching the soft cabin light, his gaze locked on the miniature chessboard balanced between them. The pieces were magnetic, cheap plastic, the White King slightly scuffed from years of use. Yet in Marcus Johnson's hands, the board looked regal, like it held the secrets of kingdoms. "Why chess?" Harrison asked finally, his voice low, careful not to disturb the child he'd only just managed to keep calm. Marcus didn't look up. He pushed a pawn forward, the click of plastic soft but deliberate. "Because life doesn't hand you choices all at once. It gives you moves, one at a time, each one shaping the next. If you can see the patterns, you can survive." Harrison studied him. There was no bravado in the boy's tone, no hunger for approval, only certainty. And Harrison, who had built empires by recognizing value others missed, felt something rare: respect. "You're good," Harrison said. Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. "I'll have to be. London isn't charity. They don't care where you're from, only how you play. If I win, there's a scholarship. If I lose—" His voice trailed off, heavy with the weight of what couldn't be said. Harrison leaned in. "And if you lose?" Marcus met his eyes at last. "Then I go home the same kid I was when I boarded this plane, a boy with a chess set and too many dreams." His words cut through Harrison more deeply than he wanted to admit. For years he had told himself that his fortune had been earned by brilliance alone, not circumstance. Yet here sat a boy who had brilliance in spades, and no safety net. He tapped a rook thoughtfully against the table. "The world doesn't reward quiet talent, Marcus. It rewards noise, branding, power." Marcus moved a knight, eyes steady. "Then I'll just have to make them hear me without shouting." The move forced Harrison's queen into danger. He blinked, surprised, then let out something rare, a laugh, genuine, unguarded. It startled him. When was the last time he had laughed like that? Olivia stirred at the sound, and both men froze. The baby whimpered, turned her head, and then, mercifully, sank deeper into sleep. Harrison's relief was palpable, but Marcus only nodded. "You see, she feels it," Marcus murmured. "Every move you make, she mirrors. Calm is contagious. So is fear." The words struck Harrison with the force of revelation. Here, in the span of a flight, a boy from economy had taught him something none of his consultants had: that leadership wasn't about control, but about presence. "Teach me," Harrison said suddenly. The request tumbled out, surprising even him. Marcus tilted his head. "Teach you what?" "Chess, babies, whatever it is you know that I don't. I've spent my life buying expertise. But you—" Harrison shook his head, the admission tasting strange on his tongue. "You carry wisdom I can't purchase." Marcus leaned back, the corners of his mouth tight. He had heard words like that before, usually empty, often laced with condescension. But there was something different in Harrison's eyes, a raw humility, foreign to a man accustomed to commanding the world. The silence between them thickened, charged with possibility. Outside the window, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, blue, black waves lit faintly by a scattering of moonlight. Inside, a billionaire and a teenager sat side by side, their lives colliding like opposing pieces on a board, neither able to predict the endgame. Harrison broke the silence with a question that sounded almost like a confession. "Do you know what it feels like to have everything and still feel powerless?" Marcus studied him, then glanced at the baby sleeping within arm's reach. His voice was quiet but unflinching. "Every day. Only difference is, for me, powerlessness isn't the exception. It's the rule." The words lingered, heavier than the cabin air. Harrison turned away, staring at the chessboard, but his mind was on the boy beside him, and the uncomfortable truth that the gulf between them wasn't measured only in money, but in perspective. For the rest of the flight they played. Harrison moved pieces with the sharp focus of a strategist, but Marcus played differently, sometimes quick, sometimes deliberate, always one step ahead, not crushing his opponent, but guiding him, teaching. And for the first time in years, Harrison Reed felt like a student again. Yet beneath the calm, suspense hummed, because both men knew this wasn't just about a game on a tray table. It was about what came next: London, Paris, decisions that would ripple through lives far beyond a single flight. And as the engines roared into the night, Harrison realized with startling clarity his own next move depended on this boy who had crossed a curtain and changed the board entirely. The plane cut across the night sky, steady and unflinching, but the two lives bound inside it could not have been more different. In first class, the billionaire leaned back, loosening his tie for the first time in years, his mind caught on the strange rhythm of humility beating in his chest. In economy, just hours earlier, Marcus Johnson had been crammed against a window, whispering promises to himself, the weight of his family's future pressed into a second-hand backpack. The contrast of their worlds played like a film reel in Marcus's memory, each frame sharpening the stakes of what lay ahead. South Side Chicago, a kitchen with linoleum worn so thin it curled at the corners, the fridge humming like it was begging for mercy. Marcus had stood there that morning in his only good shirt, collar stiff from careful ironing, staring into the mirror nailed crookedly above the sink. His mother, Gloria, had appeared behind him, eyes bloodshot from her night shift at the nursing home. She pressed his shoulders firmly as if anchoring him to the moment. "You belong there, Marcus," she'd said. "Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." Her voice had carried a strength that disguised the ache in her bones, the fatigue etched into her face. When she slipped a few crumpled bills into his palm for taxi fare, he had protested, but she'd silenced him with a look that dared him to refuse her sacrifice. In the doorway, his little sister Zoe had grinned, clutching the travel chess set she had laid out on the coffee table like a sacred offering. "I packed your lucky pencil," she had shouted. That tiny apartment, crowded with dreams and exhaustion, had been Marcus's kingdom. Every move he made on the chessboard, every night spent memorizing strategies had been for them, his mother's pride, his sister's faith. And across the city, in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Harrison. Reed's morning had unfolded with a different rhythm. Glass walls framed a skyline glittering with power. He had ended a video call with Tokyo executives, irritation still sharp in his jaw, deals, acquisitions, markets, the language of his empire. Vivian, his assistant, had appeared at the door, tablet in hand, itinerary polished to the second. Everything was ordered, everything efficient, everything under control, until the nanny had called in sick. "Sir," Vivian had said, her tone steady but edged with caution, "there's no replacement available." Harrison had bristled. No replacement? He didn't have time for problems without solutions. He had built his empire on efficiency, on eliminating chaos. Yet here was chaos in the form of 6 pounds of squirming humanity. His daughter. His wife, Catherine, was already in Paris, hosting meetings and charming investors. And for the first time, Harrison faced the prospect of traveling alone with Olivia. No entourage, no nanny, no safety net. 2 mornings, 2 families, one bound by sacrifice, the other by power. And now, above the Atlantic, those lives had collided, stitched together by the cries of a baby who had refused to be silenced. As Olivia slept in her bassinet, Harrison studied the boy seated beside him. Marcus leaned forward, arranging the tiny magnetic chess pieces with precision, his eyes distant, his mind elsewhere. "Tell me about your family," Harrison said quietly, surprising even himself. Marcus hesitated. He wasn't used to sharing with men who wore $1,000 watches and carried the world in their pockets. But the sincerity in Harrison's tone nudged him forward. "My mom works double shifts, nursing home. She keeps us afloat. My dad—" Marcus paused, jaw tightening. "He's been gone for years. It's just me, Mom, and Zoe, my sister, 7 years old, brightest kid I know." Harrison listened, the words settling heavier than any market report he had ever read. He thought of Olivia, of the world she would inherit, a world where she would never want for anything, where her every whim could be met with a swipe of a card. And here was Marcus, balancing everything on a scholarship, carrying his family's survival in the strength of his next move on a chessboard. A strange unease pressed into Harrison's chest. He realized how rarely he asked anyone about their family, not employees, not partners, not even his own daughter's nanny. His life was numbers and names on spreadsheets, meetings and margins. But here, in this boy's voice, was something raw, unpolished, unbought. "You're playing for them," Harrison said softly, almost to himself. Marcus nodded once. "Every move." Outside the window, dawn began to stretch faintly across the horizon, a thin band of light breaking the ocean's darkness. The plane hummed steadily onward, but in seat 2A, the atmosphere shifted again. The billionaire and the boy sat shoulder to shoulder, the space between them heavy with revelations neither had expected. Suspense lingered in the air. Because both men knew this wasn't a passing encounter. This was collision. Inevitability. A story already bigger than either of them, written not in ledgers or strategy books, but in the cries of a child and the quiet strength of a boy who refused to be silent. And as the first light of Europe touched the edge of the sky, both Marcus Johnson and Harrison Reed understood. They were no longer just passengers on a plane. They were players in a game whose stakes neither had yet begun to comprehend. The air inside the London tournament hall felt heavier than stone. Chandeliers cast fractured light across polished floors, and rows of tables gleamed with boards already set, pieces lined up like soldiers waiting for war. The sound wasn't silence exactly. It was anticipation. The kind of hush that hummed beneath the skin, charged with the nerves of hundreds of players, parents, and spectators. Marcus Johnson stepped inside, travel-worn hoodie replaced with the only suit he owned, pressed to sharpness by his mother's hands before he left Chicago. It didn't fit perfectly, the sleeves a fraction too short, the shoulders too narrow, but his stride carried it with dignity. Tucked beneath his arm was the battered magnetic set Zoe had given him, a talisman of home, and in his pocket the pencil she'd slipped inside as a lucky sword. He scanned the room. Banners of elite schools flanked the walls. Cambridge, Oxford, Moscow Academy, Shanghai Institute. Kids with private coaches and unlimited resources stood clustered with their teams, their laughter smooth, their confidence rehearsed. Marcus felt their eyes when they noticed him. The boy with no sponsor badge, no entourage, no whispered strategy sessions in corners. Alone. But he wasn't afraid. Fear was a luxury of the comfortable. Marcus had played chess in the glow of a street lamp while sirens howled down his block. He had faced eviction notices and still taught Zoe her multiplication tables over a board. These polished halls were no more intimidating than the cracked linoleum of his kitchen. Then, from across the room, he saw him. Lawrence Kingsley. Tall, sharp-suited, hair combed to a calculated sheen. England's prodigy, the media's darling, already rumored to be the next grandmaster. Lawrence's eyes found Marcus and lingered, narrowing with disdain. Then the smirk came, the one Marcus had seen 1,000 times in a theater. Ausenforms. You don't belong here. The pair were called to separate tables for the opening round. Marcus sat, his opponent a nervous boy from Italy who made the mistake of underestimating him. Within 15 minutes, Marcus's pieces moved like water, cutting through the board with clean precision, ending the match in silence so swift it left his opponent staring. Whispers rippled, round after round, Marcus advanced. Each victory built like a drum beat, louder, faster. Reporters leaned in, parents craned necks. The boy with no coach, no sponsor, no crest on his jacket was tearing through the ranks. But suspense thickened when the bracket posted for the semifinals. Marcus versus Kingsley. The hall buzzed. A crowd gathered before the match even began. Lawrence took his seat like a king settling into a throne, his smile laced with mockery. Southside, huh? He muttered across the table. Do they even have chessboards where you're from? Marcus didn't rise to the bait. He placed Zoe's pencil on the table, a quiet anchor, and simply said, "Make your move." The game began. The first few exchanges ordinary, pawns clashing in the center. But Marcus's eyes scanned deeper, tracing patterns invisible to most. He wasn't playing Lawrence's pieces. He was playing Lawrence's arrogance. The crowd leaned closer as Marcus sacrificed a knight early, a move so bold it drew gasps. Reckless, one coach whispered. Suicidal, another hissed. Lawrence smirked, convinced of his inevitable triumph. But Marcus was building something no one else could see, a trap hidden beneath quiet moves, waiting to spring. Each sacrifice pulled Lawrence further in, lured him into a maze disguised as victory. Harrison Reed sat in the audience, Olivia in his wife Catherine's arms. He had flown ahead to Paris, but after that flight, after that boy, he couldn't stay away. He had to see this with his own eyes. His heart raced as the board tilted toward its climax. Lawrence, grinning like a conqueror, leaned back in his chair, convinced the win was his. "Check," he declared smugly. Marcus's hand hovered over the board. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of his next move pressing like the sky itself. Then his fingers landed on a knight, scarred, humble, unremarkable. He slid it forward with quiet confidence. Gasps erupted. The knight cut through the board like lightning, cornering Lawrence's queen, unraveling his entire strategy in a single stroke. The trap snapped shut. Lawrence's smirk collapsed. He looked at the board in horror, realizing too late he had been led by his own pride. "Checkmate," Marcus said, his voice calm, unshaken. The crowd erupted, some with applause, others with disbelief. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled. The boy with no team, no coach, had just toppled England's shining star. But Marcus didn't look at the crowd, didn't bask in the noise. He picked up Zoe's pencil, slipped it back into his pocket, and let the quiet satisfaction wash over him. In the audience, Harrison Reed stood slowly, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, not in himself, but in someone else. He looked at Catherine, whose eyes softened as she watched the boy who had once calmed their daughter, now dismantle a champion. And as the hall roared around them, Harrison knew this was only the beginning. The boy from the back of the plane wasn't just playing chess, he was rewriting the rules of power itself. The lights of Paris shimmered like spilled jewels against the night sky as the Eurostar slid into the station. Marcus sat near the window, his reflection ghosted against the glass, Zoe's pencil in his pocket, his battered chess set on his lap. The victory in London still echoed in his chest, but so did the silence afterward. He had beaten Lawrence Kingsley, silenced the doubters, forced cameras to turn his way. Yet as the train slowed, Marcus knew the applause was temporary. The world didn't stay with boys like him. It used them for headlines, then moved on. Waiting on the platform was Harrison Reed. No entourage, no assistants, no polished performance. Just a father in a dark coat, his wife Catherine beside him, and Olivia cradled against her chest. The billionaire looked smaller somehow, less like the titan who towered over boardrooms, more like a man whose world had shifted in ways he couldn't articulate. Marcus stepped off the train, clutching his chess set like a shield. Harrison's eyes locked onto him. "You came," the billionaire said, as though he hadn't been sure the boy would. "You asked," Marcus replied simply. That night, they didn't meet in a marble lobby or gilded conference room. Harrison led Marcus to the suite at the Hotel George V, its chandeliers blazing gold against white stone. It was the kind of place Marcus had only seen in glossy magazines left in barbershops. Every inch screamed wealth, but all Marcus noticed was the soft cry of a baby from the nursery adjoining the master suite. Inside, Olivia thrashed in her crib, her tiny face reddened, fists balled in frustration. The nanny reached helplessly toward the bottle, muttering about schedules, routines, and what should work. Catherine looked on, her composure cracking. Harrison turned to Marcus with an urgency he would never have allowed in a boardroom. "She hasn't slept all day. Shoma." He again. Marcus froze, the eyes of billionaires, staff, and strangers all on him. He was 17 from the South Side, standing in a palace of wealth, being asked to do the unthinkable once more. He walked to the crib, his movements deliberate, calm. He scooped Olivia into his arms, his fingers finding her back, his chest rising and falling in that same steady rhythm. His hum, low and resonant, filled the room like an incantation. Slowly, her cries melted to hiccups, then to silence, then to soft, even breaths. Harrison's throat tightened. It wasn't the silence that shook him this time. It was what he saw in the mirror above the crib. Not a billionaire, not an executive, just a father, watching a boy teach him how to hold his own child. "Show me," Harrison whispered, his voice thick. Marcus nodded, transferring the baby into Harrison's arms, guiding his hands with the care of a teacher molding a student. "Not too tight. Feel her breathing. Match it. She'll learn from you." Catherine's eyes glistened as she watched her husband follow the boy's lead. For the first time in months, Olivia melted peacefully into Harrison's chest, her tiny hand curling against his thigh. Suspense lingered in the room. Staff exchanged glances, whispering at the sight of a billionaire being tutored by a teenager. But Marcus stood steady, the axis of the moment, as though this was the board he was born to play on. Later, after Olivia was asleep, Harrison invited Marcus onto the suite's terrace. Paris sprawled beneath them, the Seine glittering in the distance, the Eiffel Tower's lights blinking in rhythm with the city's pulse. Harrison poured a glass of wine for himself, handed Marcus a soda, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Harrison broke the silence. "You know what I realized tonight?" Marcus leaned on the stone balustrade, his eyes tracing the city lights. "What's that?" "I've built an empire on the belief that power comes from control. Every deal, every acquisition, every merger. Control was my religion. And then 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, a 17-year-old from Chicago taught me that the most important kind of power is letting go." Harrison's voice cracked. "You gave me my daughter tonight. Not just her silence, her trust." Marcus looked at him, the weight of the billionaire's confession pressing into the cool night air. "She was always yours. You just didn't know how to listen." The word struck Harrison like a bishop slicing across the board, unexpected and devastatingly true. They stood in silence again, the city alive beneath them. Marcus thought of his mother, her calloused hands, her tired eyes. He thought of Zoe, waiting back home, dreaming through his victories as though they were her own. He thought of the gulf between this world and theirs, a gulf so wide it seemed impossible to cross. Yet tonight, in this gilded suite, the gulf had narrowed. A boy had become a teacher. A billionaire had become a student. But beneath the quiet triumph, suspense still hummed. Because Marcus knew this moment was temporary. Tomorrow, cameras would return, headlines would distort, and the gulf would stretch wide again. Unless this unlikely alliance became something more. And as Harrison Reed turned to him, the lights of Paris painting his face in gold, Marcus felt the shift. This wasn't charity. It wasn't gratitude. It was the beginning of an offer that could rewrite everything. The scene moved like liquid silver under the Paris moon, its current carrying whispers of centuries, lovers, revolutions, kings, and exiles. Marcus walked beside Harrison Reed along the riverbank, his tournament trophy tucked under one arm, the weight of his entire life pressing invisibly on the other. They didn't speak at first. The night air was cool, the silence between them heavy but not empty, like the pause between chess moves when both players sensed the board was about to change forever. Finally, Harrison broke it. His voice was low, stripped of the polish it usually carried in interviews and boardrooms. Marcus, I've made billion-dollar deals in Tokyo, fought off hostile takeovers in New York, negotiated with heads of state in Geneva. But tonight, I realized I've never negotiated with myself. Until now. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? Harrison stopped walking, turning to face him under the glow of a street lamp. The light caught the sharp lines of his face, but in his eyes was something softer. I mean, I can't go back to the way things were before that flight. Before you. You showed me a world I had walled off, the kind of wisdom no consultant on my payroll ever gave me. I don't want to forget it. I don't want to lose it. Suspense rippled through the air. Marcus shifted, unsure where this was leading. He had heard promises before, from coaches who moved on to richer prodigies, from sponsors who pulled out when headlines shifted. What could a billionaire possibly mean by this? Harrison reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. He handed it to Marcus with a weight that made the boy's pulse quicken. Opening it, Marcus found an official letter, letterhead of the Reed Foundation, a contract draft. His eyes scanned words he could barely believe. Full scholarship, mentorship program, internship pipeline to Reed Enterprises. His breath caught. This wasn't just charity money. It was a lifeline that stretched all the way from the south side of Chicago to the upper tiers of global power. But Marcus's fingers tightened on the paper. He looked up at Harrison, suspicion flickering across his face. Why me? He asked, his voice edged with steel. You could pick anyone. Any prodigy with better scores, richer schools, perfect resumes. Why choose me? Because I calmed your baby? The question cut the air like a blade. Harrison flinched but didn't look away. Because you forced me to see my limits. Because you carry something rare, Marcus. Emotional intelligence, resilience, perspective. You weren't taught it in a boardroom or bought it in a classroom. You lived it. You turned survival into skill. And that kind of wisdom, it's worth more than anything I can buy. Marcus folded the letter and held it at his side. Sounds a lot like pity dressed up as recognition. The billionaire's jaw tightened, his voice urgent. No, listen to me. This isn't pity. Pity fades when the news cycle moves on. This is investment. I've built my empire by seeing value where no one else did. Old patents, abandoned factories, overlooked startups. And every time the world laughed until I turned them into giants. You are the rarest investment I've ever seen. You don't need saving. You need a platform. Suspense coiled in Marcus's chest. He wanted to believe. He needed to believe. But he thought of his mother, breaking her back with night shifts, of Zoe clapping for him with hands still sticky from school glue. He thought of promises made and broken by men with more power than they needed. What if I say no? Marcus asked quietly. Harrison didn't hesitate. Then I shake your hand, wish you the best, and step aside. But the offer stands, always, because I'd rather risk rejection than let brilliance go unnoticed. For a moment, only the river spoke. Headlights glided across the bridges. Paris breathed around them. Marcus stared at the contract, then at the billionaire who looked less like an untouchable giant and more like a father desperate not to miss another lesson his daughter was trying to teach him. You don't get it, do you? Marcus said finally, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. This isn't just about me. If I accept, I carry every expectation of my neighborhood on my back. Every kid who never got seen. Every mom who never got help. This isn't a scholarship. It's a spotlight. And I'm not sure I'm ready for what comes with it. The rawness of his confession startled even himself. Harrison stepped closer, his tone dropping into something fierce. Then don't do it for them. Don't do it for me. Do it because the world already put you on that board, Marcus. You made your move when you stood up on that plane. And now the pieces are shifting whether you like it or not. The only question left is, will you play the game or will you let someone else write the ending? The words hung heavy, pulsing with truth and danger. Marcus felt his chest tighten. This was no longer just about a scholarship. This was about legacy, about power, about whether a boy from the South Side could stand toe-to-toe with billionaires and claim not just a seat at the table, but the right to set the board itself. He folded the contract carefully, slipping it back into Harrison's hand. "I'll think about it," he said, but his voice betrayed the storm raging inside him. And as they walked back toward the hotel in silence, neither could shake the feeling that the next move, whichever way it fell, would change everything. Morning broke over Paris with the slow glow of gold, spilling through the tall windows of the Hotel George V. The city outside was waking, but inside the suite, tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Marcus hadn't slept. The foundation letter lay unfolded on the desk beside the carved jade chess set Catherine Reed had given him, its polished pieces catching the dawn light like tiny guardians of the decision that could change his life. He stared at the board. Pawns, rooks, bishops, all frozen in mid-battle. It looked like his own life, a boy wedged between forces bigger than him, trapped between sacrifice and opportunity. His coach's words echoed in his head. Every position has hidden possibilities. You just have to see them. A knock at the door broke the silence. Harrison Reed stepped in, his shirt sleeves rolled, his usual armor of wealth stripped away. There was no entourage, no assistance, just a man who had spent the night waiting for an answer. "Well?" Harrison asked quietly, his eyes searching the boy's face. "Did you decide?" Marcus rose slowly, gripping the edge of the desk as though steadying himself before the hardest move of a match. "I did," he said, his voice even. Suspense filled the space between them. Harrison's shoulders relaxed slightly. "And?" Marcus held up the letter. "I'll accept, on one condition." Harrison blinked, startled. "Condition?" "Yes. I won't be your charity case. I won't be the boy you parade as proof of your generosity. If you're serious about what you said, that this isn't pity, that it's investment, then it can't just be about me." Marcus's voice grew stronger, each word carrying the weight of years he'd spent being overlooked. "You build an entire program, not for one boy, for hundreds, thousands, kids like me, kids no one notices. We don't need saviors, we need systems that stop ignoring us." The demand hit like a thunder sabah lap. Harrison stood frozen, his mouth opening, then closing again. He had expected gratitude, maybe hesitation, but not defiance, not a counteroffer that shifted the balance of power in the room. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes locked onto the billionaires. "You're used to making deals where you win twice, profit and reputation. This time I'm telling you, the deal doesn't go through unless everyone wins. Build the foundation program, commit to it publicly, with your name on it, then I'll accept. Otherwise..." He set the letter back down on the desk, sliding it toward Harrison. "Find another prodigy." The room was silent except for the muffled hum of traffic outside. Harrison's chest rose and fell as if he'd been struck. The audacity of the boy's demand should have angered him, but instead he felt something unfamiliar. Admiration. This teenager was negotiating with him like no CEO, no investor, no rival had ever dared. Catherine entered then, drawn by the silence. She glanced at the two of them, sensing the electricity in the air. "What's going on?" Marcus didn't break eye contact with Harrison. "I told him my condition." Harrison exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "You realize what you're asking, Marcus? This isn't a scholarship anymore. This is a movement." "Exactly," Marcus said. "And if you're the visionary you claim to be, you'll see it's the smartest move you'll ever make. Because a program like this won't just change my life, it'll change the whole board." Catherine's eyes flickered between them, and for the first time she smiled. Not the polished smile she wore at galas, but something genuine. "He's right, Harrison. You wanted perspective. Here it is." Suspense held the room as Harrison stared at the letter, then at Marcus, then at his wife. Finally, he let out a low laugh, half disbelief, half respect. "You really are a chess player, ain't you? I came here to offer you a scholarship, and somehow you maneuvered me into funding an entire initiative." Marcus allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "I didn't maneuver you. I showed you the only winning move." Harrison looked down at the contract again. Then with deliberate slowness, he tore it in half. Marcus gasped, his heart stopping. But before anger could rise, Harrison pulled a small leather notebook from his pocket. "We'll draft a new one, bigger, bolder. You'll help me design it, not just as a beneficiary, but as a partner." The shock of it hit Marcus harder than any victory at a chessboard ever had. Not a pawn, not a piece. A partner. Catherine stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. You've done the unthinkable, Marcus. Not just calming our daughter, not just winning in London, but changing us, changing what we thought was possible. For a moment, the boy from the south side stood in silence, the weight of it sinking into his bones. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was bigger, heavier, brighter. Out on the river, church bells began to toll, their echoes rolling through the city like a declaration. A deal had been made, not in the shadows of boardrooms, but in the light of a teenager's demand for justice. And as Harrison extended his hand, Marcus shook it, sealing not just an agreement, but a revolution. What neither of them knew yet was that this program, born from a crying baby on a plane and a boy who refused to back down, would soon spark headlines across the world. Some would call it reckless, others would call it genius, but everyone would call it unforgettable. The boy who had stepped out of economy class had just changed the structure of the entire board,